Welcome to episode 55 of the How to Japanese podcast. I'm Daniel Morales. It's September 2024. We made it. Otsukare-sama desu. At the top of the podcast, I want to do a quick apology. I think my mic levels may have been a little bit low for the last few episodes. I got a comment about that on YouTube. I've been sharing the feed over on YouTube and gradually have been accumulating new listeners there. So welcome, YouTube listeners, and apologies that the mic levels there and on Spotify were a little bit low. Hopefully that has been fixed. I don't think there should be any further issues, but do let me know if something sounds off. So at any rate, it is September. Thank God we made it. Not only is it September, it's September 23rd, which is the autumn equinox. We had a long weekend in Japan this weekend, actually last week, which has been extremely nice because I don't think I've been happier to get through a month in August in a long, long time. I remember the first June when I came back to Japan in 2022 was pretty brutal. It was when I started using my umbrella as a parasol. And when I moved to Osaka in August that year, it was also stifling. And this year felt even worse than that. We had a really nice May and June. Golden Week was really pleasant, kind of cool and crisp, a little rainy, gray. But once we got into July and August, it's been terrible, not only in Osaka, but all across Japan. And I think I was kind of suffering because of that. The amount that I was able to write and the time I spent writing both hit a wall. I started tracking both of these back in March pretty specifically. I think the level of detail with which I've tracked my time has fallen off a little bit, but I've been able to track my words written still on a very micro level. I was hitting around like 7,000 to 9,000 words each month and spending upwards of about 19 hours writing each month. And in August, that dropped down to 4,600 words. I think part of that was because I was on vacation for a week down in Kyushu, so I didn't have quite as much time to write. But I think some of it also had to do with the heat. It was just brutal. You really don't want to do much other than just kind of like lie around in air conditioner and stay inside and just avoid the heat. But finally this weekend in Osaka, things cooled down a little bit. It rained yesterday, and the day before that, this wind blew in. It was windy all day. And now it seems like maybe we'll get away with no more what they call moushobi, which is extremely hot days where the temperature gets over I want to say like 35 degrees. So I think we should be under 30 degrees Celsius for the rest of the year, hopefully. Not quite sweater weather just yet. That's yet to come, but definitely out of the terrible, brutal summer. And maybe it's even pleasant enough to open up some windows and get some air inside. I tried to kind of do what I could over the last couple of months, which included doing a little bit more reading. I was reading a new set of nonfiction essays called Shiawase no Nedan. It's translates to The Price of Happiness. I discovered this little bunkobon at a reading cafe in my neighborhood. The cafe is between my apartment and a nearby park where I go running. And I noticed it almost every time I went on a run, but I usually go on a run pretty late at night. I was running, I think, during the day in the spring, but especially in summer, the nighttime is really the only time I can get out and run. And I was even running on the treadmill in the gym because it's just so much cooler. But I would see this reading cafe, it was always closed. And even when I went by during the day, it was often closed. And I finally one day like kind of went and peeked at the schedule and realized it's only open 3 days a week. And so I went for the first time over Golden Week. And it is exactly what it sounds like, a cafe dedicated to reading. It seems to be run by a woman and her mother, and they really kind of encourage patrons to read and be quiet. The signs say, "This cafe is for reading. Please come and be quiet and read." And for the most part, people comply. When I've gone, I've seen families kind of sneak up to the door with their kids, read the sign, and be like, "Okay, this isn't for me, so I won't come here." Or they'll get a couple things to go. They make some really nice desserts and coffees, and so people will get those to go. But I've had a really good time there. So I went during Golden Week and did some reading and writing, and in the last month, I've tried to go a couple of times, usually on Sundays, and I'll pick up a sandwich and a coffee, and that was kind of how I was spending some of my time. They have a few small shelves of books along the walls, and I often will go with my own book, but I also like to kind of see what selection they have. And Shiawase no Nedan, written all in hiragana, by Kakuta Mitsuyo, stuck out to me. And so I picked it up off the shelf and kind of read a few sentences, and that was enough to know that I wanted to have a copy of the book myself. And so I bought one on Mercari for like 300 yen, and I've been working through it while I eat my bento at work. I've gotten through about like 40 pages so far, and am enjoying it. It's a sort of set of essays that I think all point towards the title of the book, Shiawase no Nedan, The Price of Happiness, even though Kakuta is not mentioning that directly. She starts each piece with what it is she's purchased, the cost, and then she just kind of writes about it, not even directly saying what about it makes her happy, just kind of writing about it, the experience, all the emotions tied up in this purchase. And she's doing things like a Denshi Jisho, her first Suica card. The most recent one I'm looking at is a Kenko Shindan, so the health exam, and things like that. It's a really nice little set of essays. Kakuta seems to have a lot of writing online as well. She contributes to the UR Chintai magazine. UR stands for Urban Renaissance. It's a semi-public housing agency in Japan that offers rooms in large apartment blocks at relatively reasonable rates without as many fees as other Japanese realtors. So, for example, they don't have any reikin, which is translated into English often as key money. It's money that gets paid generally as a gift. Gift money is the other translation for it, from the tenant to the property owner. It's one of the kind of frictions in the Japanese housing market that feel maybe unusual to foreigners, but are quite normal to Japanese. But even for people in Japan, can be a bit of a hurdle. And so, Urban Renaissance is this agency that reduces that friction by offering these houses without raking. I've heard good things about UR from friends and coworkers. So if you're ever looking for housing in Japan, it might be a good place to start. They generally will have offices in major locations. So, for example, in Osaka, you can find UR offices in Umeda and Kyobashi to sit down and talk with them about finding a room. And often other realtors can introduce you to UR housing rooms if you specifically mention that to them. Often these realtors will have a little sticker on their office window that says, "We rent UR rooms." I don't know quite what that would be in Japanese, but you'll start to recognize that. But UR apparently has this magazine that they put out, and Kakuta writes a series of essays for it, which seems a little bit unusual, almost like writing for the airplane magazines. But they're nice little non-fictional essays, just like the works that are collected in Shiawase no Nedan. And so I would definitely check out that essay. I'll be using it for my Japanese reading group, and so I'll have a link to that in the newsletter this month. So yeah, at any rate, the last couple months, especially August and September, I put out the newsletter very early in August after doing one quite late in July. So I had two back-to-back pretty quickly. And so I've had most of August and September off, even though I've had the September content ready. I just haven't had time to sit down and put it in Substack, put the blog post up, get the podcast recorded, but I've had all this kind of prepared for a long time. So I've been kind of working on stuff for October later this year, also just kind of decompressing and reading. So going to this cafe, reading quite regularly. I was reading Murakami Ryu's Coin Locker Babies. It was on my bucket list of Japanese translations to read, since I hadn't read any of the other, quote unquote, the other Murakami, which is, I guess, maybe a little bit embarrassing given how much Murakami Haruki that I've read. I have to admit that I wasn't a huge fan of the book. I posted on Twitter about this, but I felt like the translation wasn't great. It did feel like potentially there was a really heavy-handed editor that was kind of making some of the English phrasing unnatural, but also it didn't really have a kind of, it felt like a book that needed a more heavy-handed narrator to kind of tie everything together given how much the point of view changes. But also the Japanese itself felt like it was pretty wild. But so it was interesting to have read it, especially knowing that what came out when it did in 1980 and what influence it had on Murakami Haruki kind of inspired him to try and write more comprehensive, bigger novels than the shorter novels he was writing early in his career. So I was getting through that. I was reading this. That was what I was reading at home at night. It was what I was taking to this Dokusho cafe when I was going. And I was reading this Kakuta Mitsuyo at lunch for Shiawase no Nedan. And then, I read a couple of her essays in this Yura Chintai and picked one out for the Japanese reading group. I want to read more of her writing. She seems like a very interesting writer. She seems to have done a little bit of translation from English into Japanese. She's been translated a little bit into English, but not too much. I don't know if her books are still in print. And I've just been kind of going with it. I know that I've put away enough material over this spring and this summer that I've got posts for a while, but I want to kind of continue on that pace so that it's never really a struggle to get something in every month. I want it to come naturally, and I think you do that by kind of continuing to sit down at the computer and make time for it, but not kind of force yourself through it if you're struggling with it. And I was struggling a little bit this summer. One thing that I think I may do to kind of watch out for that in the future is to implement a monthly Murakami post. September also marks the start of my annual Murakami Fest, which I've been doing since 2008. I've already got, I think, 4 posts up on that now with 1 left to go. So give that a look. Over the years, I've used it to look at Murakami's writing that hasn't been translated yet. And I've done that in fiction that hasn't been translated, random nonfiction passages. Some years I focused on different collections of essays and looked at 1 essay a week. There were a couple years when I was blogging through Hardball Wonderland and the End of the World, where I was doing a chapter of that book every month or every week for a month. And so for the last few years, I've been blogging through this book called Distant Drums. The Japanese title is Toi Taiko. It has not been translated. It's a travel memoir that Murakami wrote for 3 years from 1986 to 1989 when he was living in Greece and Italy mostly, but also other places in Europe, with the occasional trip back to Japan. It was published in 1990. So I've got a number of posts about this, and I just created a separate index page on the blog, which links to it in kind of chronological order of the essays as they go through the 3 years in Europe. And I realized putting that index together, there were a couple spots that I missed. And so I think I want to go back and kind of fill those in. And so take a look at that. That's at howtojapanese.com. If you look at the kind of top of the blog, you'll see a link to Distant Drums, and it will have that. The other thing that compelled me to do this is that I realized if I just did 4 or 5 posts a year, it would take me another 4 years to get through the rest of the book if I only did it every September. So I think I'm going to start doing it every month, even after this September Murakami Fest month. Not only so I can get through it faster, but also because I found that, if I was having an off day with my writing, I was able to kind of sit down and read and write about Murakami no matter how I was feeling, even if I was kind of exhausted. And I mentioned this during the kanji update back in July. I suggested that students really should, after achieving a certain degree of fluency, really let the wind of their own energy and motivation fill their sails as it comes and goes and take them in that direction, whatever direction that happens to be. Just kind of go with that motivation. And for me, Murakami's writing always gives me that energy I need to kind of keep reading, keep writing. Maybe not his recent fiction, but he's got so much of a back catalog of especially nonfiction writing that it's going to keep me reading and writing for years. And so I was prepping these Murakami posts back in July and found that that's kind of when I realized that whenever I had low energy or writer's block, I would kind of find myself, well, let me, kind of get this ready for September so that it'll be there when I need it and I'll be ready to go and I won't have to worry about it. And I kind of stopped doing that in August because I had already prepped them all. And so I think that having something to fill that downtime will be helpful and beneficial for the rest of my writing, will kind of like help me reset, which reminds me of Murakami himself. He writes fiction and will get exhausted from it, right? So one of the things he's writing about in this Distant Drums collection is writing Norwegian Wood. And he goes into very, very detailed level about it. And if you take a look at my blog post, it talks about how he kind of did a second draft in this insane, or he finished writing the book in this insane like 12-hour sprint of writing and finishing, and then rewrote it by hand over the next like 2 weeks, did this second draft by hand over 2 weeks. And so it was this insanely exhausting project. And then he goes after that, he runs the 1987 Athens Marathon. And so he's physically and kind of mentally exhausted. And now he's kind of wandering around Greece trying to rest, but at the same time feeling like, I don't know what I need to be doing. It's a very interesting kind of point in the book. And I can kind of sympathize with him not having done anything nearly as amazing as Norwegian Wood or run a marathon, but just being so busy that and tired and exhausted from the heat of the summer that you kind of have to sit back and let things come as they will. And for Murakami, that means often working on a translation, doing some other kind of nonfiction writing, and that he finds, I think, energizes him for the next novel that he's going to write. So go check out those Murakami Fest posts. I think they're very interesting. And see if you can turn this idea, this kind of top of the podcast idea, into some meta level thinking about your Japanese study, your writing, your video gaming, what you're doing with your life. What fills your sails, what helps you recharge. How can you use that to balance projects that drain you? What energizes you and what drains you? How can you kind of position those so that they are working well together and driving you forward to help you maintain consistency? So that was just an idea that I had kicking around this month. In the newsletter, I wrote about something totally different that I called Impossible Pairs. And this is a set of posts that I wrote back in the spring, I think, when I first started kind of like putting away material for the rest of the year. And I initially wrote 10 of them. And then when I went to sit down and revise them for the newsletter this month, I was like, this is entirely too much material. Going to overwhelm people, and they're not going to read through the whole thing. So I just took 2 of them for this month, and we'll introduce the others at some other point in the future. But I call them impossible pairs, and what they are is the phrases that either kind of sound extremely similar and are difficult to tell apart, or are something about them is similar and are difficult to differentiate. and you need to kind of find a strategy to get through them. They could be either homonyms, sets of pairs, antonyms, sometimes conceptual pairs that don't sound alike at all. But the main thing I think that ties them together not only is their sound or similarity in some aspect, but also the fact that they're probably not used quite as frequently by your average non-native Japanese speaker, and that it requires a strategy to create that more regular usage. But in order to do that, you need to be able to differentiate them. So it's this kind of like cycle that you have to break out of. And I call that cycle, or breaking out of that cycle, I call it brute forcing. You have to kind of come to a resolution, find a mnemonic, find a sentence that works, do something that will help you tell the difference between them so that you can break out of that not being able to differentiate cycle, so that you can then incorporate them more regularly into your Japanese. And therefore they don't feel so similar anymore eventually once you've gotten more familiar with them. I outlined brute forcing back in January 2023 when I wrote about the verb amaeru, which is a very kind of Japanese word that means to be spoiled, cling to somebody, to depend on someone. It's a difficult word to translate into English, so I recommend reading my post about it, but I also recommend not thinking about it in English, right? Not trying to think about it in English, and only really trying to do amaeru in Japanese. But what I wrote at the time about brute forcing was a 5-step plan. And the first step is realizing that you're not fully understanding something. And that's sometimes a difficult step to take because it involves this kind of meta-level thinking, this meta-level realization about yourself that, okay, I'm not fully grasping something. I need to do something about that. And once you overcome that step, sometimes the rest is pretty easy. The second step, I say, is to look up a Japanese definition and to dissect it. The benefit of this is that you're not relying on jisho.org, which obviously is a very good resource based on Jim Bream's dictionary, but you're looking at the actual Japanese. You're engaging directly with the language rather than being mediated by somebody else's translation of it. Once you do that, once you've dissected it, you need to diagram simple Japanese sentences that you understand. So find some sentences that you understand, that you know work in a native context. Either you've heard somebody use them, you've found them online somewhere, you read them in a text. And the fourth step is you look at these over and over and over again. Use them to access and understand other example sentences that you encounter. So this gives you the entrance to the rest of the meaning of whatever phrase you're looking at. And step 5 is that you eventually come to an understanding that you then hate to translate back into English because you just know it in Japanese. Your goal isn't to translate it. Your goal is to use it in Japanese. So that's, I think, enough about introducing this idea of impossible pairs. Let's take a look at the specific pairs that I'm introducing this month. The one that I start with is the original impossible pair, the one for me that I felt like was impenetrable at first, but that I've finally mastered, that I feel like I really do have a good hold on these, and that I managed it by memorizing a couple different patterns and then really kind of forcing myself to use them. And that set is tashka and tashka ni. Tashka on its own is a super useful signal, and you can start a sentence with it to mark content that you're uncertain of. So, for example, you could say, 確かテーブルに置いたんだけど。確かテーブルに置いたんだけど。I'm sure I put it on the table, but that's what that sentence literally means. But what the tashka does there is it kind of creates this, it marks this, the rest of the sentence as uncertain. So you could say, テーブルに置いたんだけど, I put it on the table, but except when you add tashka to it, 確かテーブルに置いたんだけど, you're kind of signaling to the listener that I think I did this, but I'm not sure. You're really kind of creating that sense of uncertainty about, where you'd put the object. You felt like you definitely put it on a table, but you aren't sure about it. That's the kind of situation that you would use. You would add tashka onto the front of that sentence, and you can kind of viscerally hear that sense of uncertainty in the way people use tashka. It's a kind of slower pronunciation before you get to the main part of the sentence. Tashka ni, on the other hand, represents the exact opposite. It is 100% certainty. And that's why I think these two phrases are so challenging at first, because they're kind of polar opposites like this. This is why you see tashka ni used in business phrases such as tashka ni uketorimashita. Tashka ni uketorimashita, which means I have definitely or certainly or I have indeed received something, right? Whatever it happens to be. It's not a sentence that really kind of makes any sense in English, but that's because we don't use it in English. This is a Japanese sentence. You should not think about how it's translating into English. How we're using it in Japanese is important. And I've seen it as very recently. You see it not only tashka ni uketorimashita, you also see tashka ni chodai itashimashita. Tashka ni chodai itashimashita. And this for me was always interesting to see this sentence because chodai is always has such a casual association in my mind because you hear lots of like young kids using it. Chodai, nanika chodai, right? When they want something, it's like give me, give me. Chodai is literally a kanji compound that means to receive. But we know that kanji compound in general are pretty katai, as the Japanese like to say. So it's a little bit more kind of formal to use something like kanji compound instead of a single Japanese verb. And here we see the same thing with tashka ni chodai itashimashita, something like that. This kind of casual chodai can very easily become a very formal business phrase. And so if you received a document, you could say tashka ni uketorimashita, tashka ni chodai itashimashita. And it's a very good phrase, useful phrase to signal to a business partner that you've received something that they sent you. And you can also, prove this pretty easily by typing in tashka ni uketorimashita into Google. And the results, the auto-populate results in the search engine, the few that come up are eigo, right? So people are clearly searching for English ways to say this. Okane, right? So they're looking for tashka ni uketorimashita with regard to okane. And then also business meiru reibun, so business email example sentences. Business meiru reibun. So these show you that this is probably a pretty good phrase to be using, useful business sentence, one that will send a very clear, very definite meaning that something has been received. You can also say, use tashka ni with other more casual phrases such as, tashka ni sou desu ne, tashka ni sou desu ne, or even just, tashka ni works as a very quick aizuchi phrasing in conversation. If you're saying, yeah, that's true, these are very useful ways to help differentiate between tashka ni and tashka, nantoka, 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 when you're signaling uncertainty. So I hope that helps with those two phrases, those two words. The other impossible pair I looked at this month is another one that you'll encounter very early in your studies as a Japanese student. And it is yokka and yoka. Yokka, yoka, right? This is the 4th and the 8th day of the month, right? So you're going to learn this, I would say, probably within your first month of studying Japanese if you're a first-year student. I would like to say it's not fair that they sound so similar, but I think every language has something like this. English, for example, has 4th and 5th, which are extremely similar and arguably even closer together than yokka and yoka. I'm still trying to perfect these. It's one of the most frustrating, impossible pairs that I've ever had to deal with. And the only brute force mnemonic that I seem to be able to come up with is one that I'm kind of reminded of uh, by the mnemonic my fourth grade teacher gave me to differentiate dessert and desert. When I was in fourth grade, I did not know how to spell the desert and dessert, the difference between these two. So I guess I must have written dessert with just one S in an essay or something. And so this teacher, Miss Wallace, she said, "You want more dessert? See, dessert has more S's." And I've never forgotten that. And for me, the only mnemonic that I could come up with yoka and yoka is long vowel later date, long vowel later date, long vowel later date. And I'm still trying to kind of slam that into my brain so that I can start to kind of use these two words with more confidence. And as I was doing research for the newsletter, I started to look into whether Japanese native speakers also struggled to differentiate these two dates. And I found that they do. So I think that's a little bit of a confidence booster for us non-native speakers, that we shouldn't feel too bad about struggling with how similar these are, because native speakers are struggling with it as well. If you search, for example, on Twitter for the hiragana yoka and yoka, you'll find a lot of different people telling their own stories. For me, I found a number of people saying that they confirm yoka by saying hachinichi. So, for example, if they're talking on the phone, they'll say yoka hachinichi desu ne, to kind of just to make sure, oh, yep, the 8th, I don't want to accidentally make my reservation on the 4th. One of them said that one of their friends must have called them out and said something and said, oh, hey, you always say like hachinichi instead of yoka. And the friend said, I don't care, I'm not changing, I'm still going to keep using it. So if you really absolutely cannot get one of these pairs differentiated, I think that there are probably some other solutions that you can use. And this is, I think, a perfectly good one, especially if you're doing something like making a reservation over the phone. Although I find that with reservations in Japan, you're almost always confirming the day of the week in addition to the date. So that can solve, I think, a lot of the problems in terms of if you might accidentally give the wrong date, because the person at the store is likely to confirm what day of the week it is, you're probably not going to mess up too badly. So that's one good thing to realize. And that's all I have for impossible pairs this month. As I mentioned, I have written out at least 8 others that will hopefully be incorporated into future newsletters. And if there are any that come to mind that you're having trouble with, send them my way and I'll see if I've got anything that can help me differentiate them. That's all I've got for you this month. I had enough, I think, iro at the front of the podcast, so I won't take up too much more of your time here at the end, other than to say, use this month's podcast, newsletter, blog post as a wake-up call, whatever you need it for. You know, if you need a push to read something new or write something new, check out a new restaurant, you know, something like that. Use this as your wake-up call. But I would say especially local restaurants. Go and check out that small neighborhood coffee shop or yakitori place that you've been walking by. Be the joren kyaku, be the regular customer that the world needs, especially in Japan in these small neighborhood businesses. Go meet new people, try new food, find new books and authors. Maybe I just moved to like a really perfect neighborhood. Maybe I was just very lucky with where I moved, but the small community that I moved to in January seems to be just filled with amazing little restaurants. There's a little Indian restaurant nearby. There's a Nepali restaurant. There's a family-run sushi spot. There are a huge range of little izakaya. There is a wonderful little teppanyaki spot. There are a half dozen coffee shops and cafes, including this Dokusho cafe that I mentioned. And they're not really like grouped into one single shotengai either. They're really kind of all over the place. Whichever direction I walk, I seem to find some little weird cafe or something that I noticed. Like the other thing that I noticed the other day was a yoga class that was like underneath this house where there was like a kind of either a parking lot or a bike parking lot or something. You had to like walk under there, and there's this very colorful door advertising the yoga classes that I assume somebody was running out of their house or something like that. There are places like this all over Japan, I think, in cities everywhere. But obviously, urban locations like Tokyo, Kyoto, Fukuoka, Sendai, things like that with walkable communities have a lot of them, and they rely on people living in these neighborhoods to kind of run them. So go out there and pay it forward. Try something out. Don't let these places just kind of escape your attention. Worst case scenario, you're out 1,000 or 2,000 yen if you realize quickly that you've kind of landed on a lemon. But best case situation, you might end up like me with a new author, a new book to read, a new place to spend your Sunday mornings, or somewhere to get a late dinner after you're coming home from work. Yep, I'll leave you with that this month. And thanks for listening, and we'll see you in October.